continuing legacy of that investigation and of his contributions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield.
Thank you all. Thank you all of you for joining me here. It is my honor to be one of those to memorialize Dr. Clyde Snow. I will share with you today my connection to him through the Tulsa race massacre investigation and our ongoing race massacre investigation. And I really am grateful to be here at this time with you. If you have, while I'm not intentionally showing human remains in this presentation, the next slide does have a death image on it. So if that's a taboo or a problem, please be prepared to guard yourself against the next slide. And on that note, let's go forward. So my knowledge of, I have to move my cursor, my knowledge of my interaction with, here we go. Sorry, technology, gotta love it. So my interaction with Clyde Snow, my exposure to him began with this book by Christopher Joyce and Eric Stover. I read this book probably when it was new, in 1991. And it introduced me to Clyde Snow's busy career in forensic anthropology. Now, his role that I recalled, just that lingered with me, was his identification of Joseph Mengele. And that is always the case that I can bring to mind. He had activity in other famous forensic cases here in the United States, but it was that one, that ID, that made me realize that I could have a role in forensic anthropology. I read that book when I was a master's student, and it was some years before I went on to pursue my PhD. And my next interaction with Dr. Snow came indirectly. I was providing a workshop for El Centro de Análisis Forense y Ciencias Aplicadas in Guatemala, which was an organization for forensic analysis that started with a forensic anthropology application, kind of, let's say, in a friendly competitiveness with the FAFG, the Fundación de Antropología Forense de Guatemala, which was the organization founded through the activity of Dr. Snow. Dr. Snow was their mentor, trainer, their inspiration in helping the FAFG identify those disappeared in the internal conflict. And so when Kafka was started, I became aware of the activity of the original, or the older organization, and Dr. Snow's involvement in that. And it made sense to me then, years after that, about 2 actually, after my work, that workshop with Kafka. The original investigation we called the Tulsa Race Riot investigation started. So it made sense to me that Dr. Snow was involved. Get this. So this is the picture. It's from the book, but this is the image I always have of Dr. Snow. I did not get to work with him directly in the race riot investigation. So our paths just always overlapped, or he was always traveling internationally if I was in Tulsa. And so, and he was senior in his career compared to my fledgling ABD, almost a doctor stages. So I can't say that I got to work with him directly and closely, but I have benefited greatly from his leadership and his direction. And so more on that here shortly. So I wanted to go into a little bit of background just in case on whether you call it the race riot, Tulsa Race Riot, the Tulsa Race Massacre, or modern term for what happened there. Here's a little bit of background on what occurred. So Tulsa, as a city, had a neighboring section, not in the incorporated city limits, called Greenwood. It was the Negro section, or the colored section. And Greenwood represented, let's say, about 40 blocks of space where Black people owned property. There were Black business owners, and was a complete economic zone. And so the way I think of Greenwood, the way I envision it, or the kind of examples I give to try and say, hey, this is what Greenwood was then, is think in terms of, like, you could start with, say, like Chinatown. I grew up in Los Angeles and we had a Chinatown. Now, I was too young to appreciate it, so I can't look back and go, well, did Chinese people live and work there? I don't know. Now, when I go to LA, I go to Koreatown. Do Korean people live and work there? I still don't know. I will eventually have to do some research. But the model I am fully informed about that works is the student area of a college town. At least two of my previous institutions had zones where students lived in particular. Like if you think of Santa Barbara, back in my day, it was Isla Vista. You'd say, oh, Isla Vista, that's where the students live. Affordable lodging close to campus. Here in Gainesville, it's the Southwest Quadrant, full of apartment living and services aimed at students. So the difference being, students aren't owning these services. They're not owning the lodging, any of the lodging, or rarely are, but they are living and working together, and there's a lot of transit activity. So students come in, in the fall, and then they leave at the end of the semester, at the end of 4 years, but it's a transient population. And Greenwood was like that. If you look at the 1920 census, the census before the disaster, you'll see a lot of boarding houses, one individual as a homeowner or a landlord or landlady, and then 12 individuals boarding. And so the amount of people living in Tulsa that were coming in to make their fortune or to change their lives was high. And that's why I find the college town model more appropriate. But if you, this picture, courtesy of Don Ross, Calvin Ross's dad, this picture shows what Greenwood was like as a neighborhood, just what you would expect, with transportation, brick buildings, street power poles at any rate. So it was a thriving community. And then this happened. And if you want an interesting experience, search for the phrase "nab Negro" in newspapers, on newspapers.com or whatever archival resource you like to use. I'm not advertising for newspapers.com. That's just the one I use. But you will have an interesting experience. Don't do it when you're feeling down. But at any rate, the "nab Negro" for attacking girl in an elevator, that link there is where you can look if you want to go and read the original there yourself. I had trouble finding a copy of this text. So the basic story, young man, Dick Rowland, is accused, he's a black man, he's accused of molesting in some way a young white girl elevator operator, and he's arrested, and a white lynch mob forms outside the jail to take him and lynch him. But in this case, the black citizens, the leaders of Greenwood, who came together and said, hey, rule of law, we get to have rule of law. He gets to have rule of law. And so these black leaders went multiple times to the jail and to try and interfere and get the sheriff to do some leadership, or the chief of police to do some leadership. And the police chief said, no, I got this. But the white mob never dissipated. There was a confrontation in the mob. I'm summarizing grossly, but there was a confrontation, shots were fired, and the rest led to multiple individuals killed that night, May 31st, 1921, and then a white mob forming in the daylight hours of June 1st and entering Greenwood, which, remember, was north of Tulsa itself and not an incorporated part of Tulsa. It was north of the Frisco Railroad tracks that were the boundary between the two areas. They entered Tulsa systematically. This white mob was systematically looting and setting fire to the homes there. They would go into homes, pile bedding up into the center of the house and set it on fire, or if there were curtains, they would set the curtains on fire, and they would steal anything that they wanted to keep. And they did that systematically for about 35 city blocks. And meanwhile, the Black Tulsans, who numbered about anywhere from 10 to 12,000, the Red Cross leader who came to head the Red Cross activities on June 5th, he estimated about 12,000 Black Tulsans, but they were outnumbered, clearly outnumbered by the rest of Tulsa. the white Tulsans who were shooting and looting. And so in the end, well, let's look at a few pictures. If you want a detailed history, I strongly recommend Mary Parrish's book. Just don't buy it. I mean, don't let anyone sell you an historical original copy when you can just read it for much cheaper, and or get a PDF. But it's a very nicely detailed. We would just say she's a reporter now. She was a typist, but she left town, came back on the 2nd. Here's some summary. She left town the wee hours of the 1st with her daughter, came back the next day on the 2nd and found that Greenwood was destroyed. But then she promptly set about finding a way to get her parole to get out of the internment camps. And because as a Black person, all the Black people around Tulsa, some of the surrounding cities too, on the road to a city or back, they got interned as well. All the Black Tulsans had to have a white person vouch for them to leave in order to leave an internment camp. And Mary Parrish just states in there, when did I ever need a white person? And it's just, and I didn't have space for some of, it's not that I don't, if you're white out there, I'm not saying you have a problem, but that concept, there's a cultural concept there of who Black people are to white people at this time that I will just say I grew up in California. But I can see now, and when I read other historical documents, I can really see how the circumstances that Black people were living in, the cultural context, second caste, maybe third caste individuals, especially in Oklahoma. There's a strong chance they were third caste, because second caste would have been Native Americans. And that's only to white people. And many Native Americans were passing as white, not quite by this time period perhaps, but you had to read the papers. That's a whole other cultural concept, because it's not complete, but probably Black Tulsans were third. And it's an interesting context of being in a caste system. Because right now, nowadays, would you say we have a caste system? I mean, I'm like, no. The closest I think of ever coming to a caste system is the concept of servants. I don't have any servants. I resist strongly acquiring any servants because I have an upstairs downstairs approach to having servants, meaning to get rid of a servant, you have to divorce them and you can't just unhire them. And, who has servants? But, hairdressers, if you have a hairdresser, how do you get rid of your hairdresser? I don't have a hairdresser because I don't want to have to divorce the hairdresser in order to pick a different one. But at any rate, servants. So that's the closest we come to what some of the experiences were for Mary Parrish's time. So she comes back and starts collecting narratives and what had happened, and eyewitness testimony of what had happened, and witnessing herself what the recovery was like. So this is early July, June 1st, where Greenwood is burning and white Tulsans are just life as usual going along. I guess the wind was in a good direction because no one seems worried. More images of Greenwood on fire, June 1st, and then internment. And these are photos you can see, well, it said, the special collections, you can visit these photos, but the internment process, and I'm not sure what the fear was, but generally, the thought was this is white against blacks. The blacks are in uprising there, and so blacks defending themselves or appealing to rule of law, defending themselves in their neighborhood in Greenwood, that's uprising. And that idea is well developed in the newspaper at the time, but again, time. Just read the June 3rd article by interview with Barney Cleaver, the Black deputy, and you'll see what I mean. But at any rate, here's a picture of the Detroit homes. That's a nice house. See how nicely appointed that particular home is? And these homes were set on fire. The North Detroit homes were set on fire on the morning of June 1st, after the Oklahoma City National Guard had arrived. So Mary Parrish makes a strong point about that too. They didn't interfere in time. They did not declare martial law in time. They got there at 9, declared martial law at 11. So there wasn't enough time to protect those homes. But if they had, they could have forestalled some destruction of property, at least for the blacks who had very, very nice homes and property. Like my own aunt and uncle this is the closest context I come to the personally, because I grew up in LA. My parents grew up in Tulsa. And when I first became involved in the race massacre investigation back in 98, I said, hey, there was like a race riot in Tulsa back in the 20s. And my mother said, yes, your Aunt Anna lost her house. So this is her aunt, or her husband's aunt, actually, my great aunt, Anna, who was married to Ellis Walker Woods, who was a player later in the recovery. They lost their house. It was one of these Detroit houses. So this is two of the panoramics I like to show regarding the scope of damage. What I really like about these images is that they're from two different time periods. Here you can see there's still smoke rising. This picture was taken very soon, probably June 1st, if not the 2nd. The things are still burning. The bottom image, which is the one that's archived at the Smithsonian, has tents already up. So this is the recovery phase started and cleanup phase. But this is a closer view, easier to see the kind of destruction where even the brick buildings are destroyed, and it's just destruction for as far as you can see. And what was the summary outcome? Well, you hear about it in the news. There were no reparations. In my course of channeling my inner Clyde Snow, I came across this newspaper article. This I just found just 2 days ago, oddly enough, because I wasn't looking for it. Together with the contribution of $100 towards relief comes the wired announcement from the National Life and Accident Insurance Company's president, C.A. Craig, at Nashville, that no attempt will be made by the company to make use of the rioting clause in the policies held, but that everything possible will be done to adjust without delay any claims that may be made against the company on account of the riot. Now, I don't know who was insured by this company, but the riot clause was invoked for the Black victims, the Black residents who lost property. Some white residents did lose property because they were property owners in Greenwood. Some homes were owned by whites, but not nearly so many to make up for the scope of destruction. This is it says partial list of losses also available. The appendices in Mary Parrish's book are a long list of losses, because many of the businesses in Greenwood were boarding houses. And so anyone who lost a home just lost their home. They didn't just lose their home, they lost their business. And it's just painful. But also notice that she starts the list with some well-known business owners. When you walk the cemetery, Oak Lawn Cemetery, you'll see some of these names, not necessarily Gurley, but Cherry and Gist. You'll see their names of headstones from those families still in Oak Lawn. That's a whole other project and story, but moving on. So what happened? 1921. By 1922, end of 1922, much of Greenwood was rebuilt. Now, there were problems because the city dads had, the city commissioners decided early on to put in a fire ordinance that buildings had to be a certain height and made of brick. And so they forbade the Greenwood residents to rebuild, and they installed police to prevent rebuilding. There's a long comment about that by the Red Cross supervisor, Maurice Willows. He talks about that conflict extensively in his report, because he's not there to be into politics, but he's supposed to be helping the Greenwood residents recover, yet they're being prevented in rebuilding, and he's there to provide resources for recovery. So there were multiple conflicts. It could be a whole study in and of itself, or a class, and just the general attitude of the city commissioners, it kind of flipped and flopped, because they certainly weren't going to provide reparations. The city was not going to provide reparations, even though at the end of their own investigation, they determined that the chief of police was at fault. The Blacks were at fault, and the chief of police was at fault for the riot, because the chief of police at fault because he didn't control the people well enough. And so that was the end of the matter. It didn't matter that there were white Tulsans going into Greenwood and looting and burning. It didn't matter that some of them were police, sheriff, and Tulsa National Guard. That's why the Oklahoma City National Guard had to come in. So none of that mattered. At the end of the day, the Blacks were insurrectionists, and the chief of police was not on his job. So in that context, saying, oh no, you can't rebuild, makes perfect sense. But in the end, there were too many white property owners who couldn't rebuild either, and because of this ordinance. And then there were lawsuits. Greenwood residents had organized to sue as well. So eventually it went away, and they were still rebuilding at the same time. So the police were dismissed and the rebuilding proceeded. So not to say that many Tulsa Greenwood residents didn't spend the winter of 21 in tents, because many of them did, but at least the rebuilding had started. So we come into this event because the history wasn't just left to lie, it was suppressed. So this in Tulsa, and suppression can vary, right? So, you know, I didn't know anything about it. My parents grew up there. I didn't hear anything about it. So, you know, if it's not on your radar and you don't talk about it. So this is a copy. This is the copy available to me of the Tulsa Tribune with the NAB Negro article in it. This is the copy I can get. And so you notice it's got this nice blank spot in it. So who scans in? I mean, the microfilm. This is from the microfilm, the archival microfilm. Who archives? Well, actually, if you look through archives, they're in a variety of states, so I shouldn't complain. So at any rate, yeah, the history wasn't maintained as history. You know, who writes history? The victors. So the concept of, oh yeah, we just idly destroyed the whole neighborhood. No, we didn't do that. The blacks did that. They did that to themselves or to each other. We'll just spin this history whichever way we want to spin it. And so in that context, in the late 90s, a race riot commission formed to identify survivors and to develop a clear historical record instead of the record of hearsay and lack of records. And so the consultants to the commission, John Hope Franklin, Scott Ellsworth, Richard S. Warner, Clyde Collins Snow, Robert L. Brooks, Alan H. Whitten, Leslie Rankin Hill, myself, Larry Odell, and Alfred Brophy. Now, we were the scientific consultants to the commission. So we produced a report that came out, oddly enough, at the end of 2000 to the commission. And one of the chapters Clyde Snow wrote, and in it, he summarized the available data on the confirmed deaths due to the Tulsa race riot of 1921. So oddly enough, if you check the online copies, his tables aren't in it. So if you want to see the actual tables he produced, you have to find one of us that has a paper copy, and or at least a better digital. The easy to access ones don't have the tables. I don't understand that. But if you have access to the tables, you can reproduce one like this. And this is I extracted fields from his table on the known documented dead. So this data, according to Dr. Snow, was based on the death certificates collected at the time, that he was able to collect at the time. So he has 39 decedents with death certificates. And if you look at this, you'll notice, or what I'll point out is, there are whites and blacks. Most of them are black, but very many of them are white. But the thing to notice is that, or what I like to point out here, is that there's a lot more information known for the white decedents. Clyde Snow points this out. They received full documentation. The white decedents received full documentation in their death certificates. Even now, it is difficult to reconstruct information about some of the identified black decedents. Like, here we go, Andrew Jackson. His birthplace is parenthetical because I put that in. He was born in Tennessee, but at the time, without the internet, and because we didn't have internet back then in the late 90s. We didn't really have it yet. I mean, it was forming, but at any rate, the knowledge of the birth, death. I can't find an obituary in a newspaper from the time for Dr. A.C. Jackson, and he was a notable physician in Tulsa. He was murdered by a white teenager while exiting his house. He was just shot outright with his hands up. Mary Parrish she interviewed an eyewitness who jumped out of the way when he was next for the next bullet. At any rate, I don't know that we'll ever be able to reconstruct as much information for some of the black decedents because they're just are fewer records. More on that here in a second, but records are not as available. So if you look at the death certificates for some of these individuals, even the named ones, it just doesn't have any information. It's just all unknown, or blank, or mainly they just write in unknown. And so what's the time period? We're in 1921. Oklahoma started collecting vital statistics in 1908, and it was getting pretty good by 1912, and certainly by 1914, 15. They were pretty, the state was pretty interested in births and deaths, and especially the deaths. More on that later. Sorry, there's always more on that later. But so records, that's why we have any kind of death certificate for these decedents, but incomplete ones for the Black decedents, the Black insurrectionists. Oh yeah, we're not going to put in a lot of information, not just because they're insurrectionists, it's because they were Black. And I say that, well, I have a bias, obviously Black, but I noticed that the trying to get information, just like obituaries for Black people in any of the time periods for Oklahoma history, it's hard to do for the newspapers available, the archives available. It's harder to do. It's just the information isn't, the record isn't as thorough. And I'll give you an example later. So here's the other side of the table. And what you'll see, what I'm going to point out here is that we have many unidentified Blacks that were buried all in Oak Lawn. Some of the Black decedents were transported, some of the known ones like, well, Dr. Jackson, he was transported. And I point that out because it was very common for decedents to be transported. Their bodies were shipped home all the time. And that's new to me. I think of people dying and being buried, they die where they're from and they're buried, or they die where they moved to and they're buried. But no, and keep in mind that Tulsa was a transient location anyway. You're not going to be from there. Why are you going to be buried there? So transport was frequently the case. These individuals, many of them were buried on the 2nd, June 2nd, or they're like this block of unidentified Blacks that we don't know for sure when they were buried, because we don't have the record receipts from funeral homes for their burials like we do for the people we call the original 18, this set of people. We have their death certificates and receipts for burial for some of the unidentified. So we go, okay, we know they're buried where? In Oak Lawn Cemetery. And but the other ones, records lacking. And well, go on, because we'll be here all night. So what is our goal? We want to find all of the victims. And what that all means, we don't know how many victims there were, but there are clues that saying 18 Black victims, 21 Black victims is not, it won't, is just a minimum, it won't be the number. I mean, here's one of the clues that the Salvation Army is saying, oh, we hired grave diggers for 2 days to bury decedents without coffins. We just had that many bodies. We don't know where, but we had to hire people. We go, well, it's a narrative. How do we know? You didn't tell us where. How do we test that there are more dead? There are more clues. So we came together, the city of Tulsa, Mayor Bynum, the remnants of the consultants to the commission, the remnants, because by the time we came back together in 98, Dr. Snow had passed, a few of the other consultants had passed. One of the historians, Bob Warner, he had passed. Many of us had retired. Leslie Rankin-Hill had retired. I'm down to my last, I'm the last original human osteologist. It's the big box of forensic anthropology in it. And there were 3 of us now, but we have a new team. So, but yeah, we came back together. Scott Ellsworth got a call from Mayor G.T. Bynum, and the mayor said, hey, is there any hope of bringing everyone, or whatever everyone is left, back together? And yeah, and Scott called around and he called me, am I still in? I said, yeah, I'm still in. And so we came back together and formed a new team, and we are a great team. I just can't stress that enough. This is the June 2021 team, much like the October 2020 team, but I don't have time to go into our various stages of investigation, but I did want to highlight that we're not just smiling because the camera's there. We work well together. And that's despite our conflicts of profession, investment. You know, we have everyone from public oversight committee members here. There's Christy Williams. We have grad students from various programs. I borrowed these two from Heather. Heather Walsh-Haney, my sister from another mother. Oh, she missed this photo, by the way. She's probably online going, I missed that photo. Yeah, because she doesn't have a copy of it. But at any rate, the representatives from the city, Brian, who's the best photographer ever, Kevin Ross, who's chair of the physical investigation. Oops, sorry, my lights are on a timer, which means I guess I better talk faster. We do very good work together when we're out there in the field. We also have we hired some contract archaeologists to help us with the excavation, the manual excavation of the burials. Cardinal archaeology, there's Ryan Peterson, their head, and there are many people, but you know, all I can say is if any of them needed a letter of reference as far as working in the field anyway, because that's what I know about, I would be very supportive. So here's an overview I'd like to show of. This is from October 2020, but I like this view because this is the Black Potter's Field. You can see some of its margins, interstate over here, Route 66, 11th Street there, this tree that I have worries about, and this lint. Everything that looks like little white specks or it looks like an actual headstone, they're headstones. So they're headstones in the Black Potter's Field. There are many headstones there. It's not a blank surface. So people in a potter's field can have headstones. You can't see the white potter's field from here because it's behind, you know, it's this direction from this tent. But you can see how we were, especially in 2020, digging around area that already had headstones in it. We were targeting blank areas with no headstones, but had signals under the earth. So in 2021, we moved the headstones and dug comprehensively to address these areas that had no headstone and some kind of signal underneath. And what we found was that there were graves there, 30 graves, and they were classic graves. We exhumed 19 individuals. There were, of those individuals, 5 were juveniles, and since our target, the original 18 concept, was for adults, male adults, at least, and this is my bias, for our time and energy, I wanted to focus on adult males in plain caskets because you know, time, money, and we were seeing a variety of individuals, men and women, caskets all the way from plain to fine, you know, caskets where you clearly were making an investment where you were saying, my love is shown by the ornaments on this casket. And so people who were intentionally buried, and then maybe some people who were thrown away, like 5 or 6 people probably discarded, at least 2. And by that, I mean, we had one guy who his casket was facing the wrong way. You know, all the here, I'll show you a picture of the burials, this overview. So these are the empty burials before we were going to put everyone back. And this image actually was taken before it started raining. I was going to put in a picture of what it looked like after it started raining for the whole next week, but time. So you see the burials, they're facing east-west. They're nicely aligned and they're in rows. I mean, look at that, rows. And so this speaks to my own problem. This was a big surprise for me. I did not, when I say Potter's Field, my mind, even now, thinks chaos. It thinks bone field. It thinks bones, you know, half of one casket shoved through half of another, no alignment. And instead, we dug into this one and found it's a cemetery under there. And this concept, if you look right here, you see, oh, these smaller rectangles, these are infant burials. And this is an infant row. And this cemetery has infant rows in it in other places. And I'll show you here in a second. So what did I learn? You know, the other aspects learning from just this excavation alone, aside from the biases. The headstone placement in the Black Potter's Field, you know, so there's that Potter's Field thought. So if I see a headstone in a Potter's Field, my brain goes, yeah, that headstone, you know, who knows who's buried there. But now I know that the headstone locations are probably as meaningful as any kind of headstone placement in a monitored cemetery. This is a city cemetery. The cemetery was placed in Tulsa in the model of, oh, cemeteries are part of our public spaces that are beautiful ornaments of our city. You know, that's the cemetery model they were following. You can read about it in the paper. And so this was their second city cemetery. The first one is located where the BOK Center is, quite possibly on it. Still trying to confirm if they actually moved the burials, but that's a newspaper search ongoing because, you know, I don't actually need to know. I'm just curious. But this was the second cemetery. And I'll give you a little, well, because I'm still channeling my inner Clyde Snow, because we found a cemetery in the Potter's Field underneath, you know, we found an actual cemetery, but we did not find, you know, a whole slew of Black males in caskets or just Black males. You know, we found a population of people. So that led me to wonder just what can we know about this cemetery? You know, how it was populated, because, you know, the Black Potter's Field was a surprise. So, well, we have resources. We can study, we can look at records. So there are a few records, but we are actually dealing in a context of history suppressed. So what does that mean? So the city has a ledger, I call it a ledger, and it's a compilation of records that derives an Excel file now that's based on compiled books. So there were cemetery books, and there are references to books with numbers existing that information was drawn from to create this ledger. So that's most of the ledger until about 1936. And then after 36, it turns into an accounting book. You pay the fee to bury someone, and their burial fees, I'm pretty sure, because when the reference says friend dug the burial, you know, it'll say friend dug grave or sibling dug grave, then they don't pay the fee. So the 36 on, and this record goes to 2009, no, 5, I think, 2005, the version I have. They're recording fees and what's that word? I lost it. You know, the word for mortgages, not mortgages. You buy the whole thing outright, but land sales for the plots in the cemetery, it starts tracking those guarantee of sepulcher or warranty of sepulcher, I think they're called, when you buy a plot. And so if you walk this area, and I dragged my colleague Angela Berg and poor Bob Pickering, it was a really hot day, and one of our grad students, Jen, one of the OU grad students, Jen, I dragged them on a field trip through the Black Potter's Field because there are a lot of headstones in there, and they're not in that ledger. There's not a record of any of the people clearly buried here in that ledger. You go to the Y Potter's Field, and yeah, you can see correspondence between the markers with marking on them and the ledger. It's not one-to-one. I won't claim that, because who has record keeping like that? But here's a picture of what the cemetery looked like before 1917 to them. You know, it was platted. It was intended as an organized space, and ignore that. So then, this is I cobbled together some additional plats, like if this weren't a presentation, you could just drag these off. But after 1917, the city platted these additional areas. So what you're seeing are, if we go back here, it says, oh yeah, check this. So they weren't using this spot or this much of this area or whatever is going on over here. And certainly this angle they weren't using before 1917. I have not established for sure what was going on, that they were able to use it, but we have clues. I mean, we've seen visually that soil was brought in. So there's something low-lying about here. Oh wait, no, we didn't dig there. Here, this area has low-lying, it has fill in it. And then we encountered fill here, not a lot of fill, they needed to put in more. But at any rate, we encountered fill here in the Black Potter's Field. So my minimum hypothesis is that sometime around by 1917, they brought in enough fill to deal with stream beds that were running through these areas. And that made them available for interment. But so none of this is to scale that you're seeing here. Like this is to scale, but I just pasted these on top of their spaces. And this should be a little crooked, but I couldn't get it to be aligned the way I wanted. So that's the first burial recorded in the ledger. And it's from 1870. The person had died in 1872, 1883 maybe. And their burial was moved from the old cemetery to this one. So this is just a representation of a project I have of plotting in the time that they recorded the ledger. I've been plotting the ledger, nothing to scale, but what you should get out of this eye-breaking image is that there's this rash of activity over here. And then over here, you know, not a whole lot's going on. Well, the year is 1905. And the city is really just turning into a city. The charter's in the paper, they're a city. By 1905, the allotments have timed out. So now you can buy a Native American's allotment, they can sell their allotment. And so commerce and property is just picking up by 1905. So this is what the cemetery looked like prior to that. I've only plotted in a few in 1905. And one in particular I'll point out, oh wait, wrong way. This is just showing that, oh, entries of white people are still going in a predictable fashion. And these are plots that people bought. But over here, this is section 15, still section 15. So section 13 and 14 are for colored people. And so they're tiny and over here. And by tiny, think of tiny in terms of proportion of the population, really, especially at this time. But this guy here, his name is Adi Morgan, and he's the first entry into section 15. And I know you guys can't say, but guess what color he is? Yeah, you're right. So I don't know what was going on with 14 and 13, but occasionally Black people were in section 15. 1905 was before the Jim Crow laws were, you know, a lot of them were published in Oklahoma. And I don't know at which point the segregation of the cemetery became vital. But if you look on this, you know, general representation, this dog leg right here is the Jim Crow line. In real life, if you walk down this way and you look through the fence and see a pole that has the pedestrian crossing sign on it, you have walked the Jim Crow line. So on your right hand, you'll be the Black Potter's Field, and on the left, you're still facing that pole sign, is the White Potter's Field. So why a dog leg here? You know, I'll probably never figure that out. But anyway, let's celebrate Mr. Adi Morgan because his headstone is still there and intact. So he's there in the ledger. He bought his space, or well, someone bought it actually, and he's still there. We found him on the field trip. Who knew? So this is the beginning of the view I wanted to show you of how section 19 was used, because there's very little information for section 20. Here are all the burials recorded in the ledger for section 20, the Black Potter's Field. Yet we've already uncovered more people than this in our work in July. Yet these are the only ones listed. And the interesting thing too about their listing is that this guy here, this is Wallace Moore. He's a World War I veteran. He was buried in, where'd my cursor go? He was buried in 1918. This guy here was buried in 1920. This is Orlando Gibbs, also a World War I veteran. And so they were buried pre-disaster. Then over here, farther west, then west is the direction you go to think of cemetery getting full. Further west is Raymond Cox. He's here. And in row 30, this is row 30, 1923. And UC Van, 1923. So fullness is only like 2 years later, but it's fullness. So let's look more closely at what's going on with section 19, because that's the only model we're going to have for how full should we expect the cemetery to be, except for what we did expose. And I say that because we think there are a few spots that didn't have burials in them, even for us, even though we could see burial, orderly place. We encountered maybe 2 locations, maybe 1. I'll let my archaeology colleagues speak to that though. So this nice plot is how section 19 was used from 1903 to 1933 according to the ledger. Now the painful part of this is there are 100 burials represented by this squiggle. 100 burials in an area that, depending on how you play, you know, how many adults are placed, could hold about 1,250. So I'm going to show you this eye-breaking slide next that shows you how people entered into section 19, how it was populated in that time span. So I apologize in advance for the eye pain that you're going to experience. But as I scroll through here, so the first one in the ledger is from 1903, before cityhood, truly, but you know, cemeteries for you. 1904, no month date, and then back over here. And we stay generally over here, putting people in, and this general idea of concentration. We're in 1918 now. Oh, now we're starting to branch out for the west, and look how far south we've gotten. So, okay, we're now in the I think that says 1921. Let's scroll back a little. Yep, still says 1921. So the cemetery by 1920 is getting the aspect of fullness. I say that because the burials are further south. And so that's, you know, they're getting to the end of rows when clearly they like to be up here to start, and heading north being early. I used to say early in the year, but a lot of these burials, like this burial here, is May 1919, not January. And it's the first burial in that row. So yeah, I don't know about always early in time. These are red because they're family, they're combs. This is a comb, this is a comb. They died, we don't know which day, but they were buried in much different places. What's probably going on is one is an adult, they're probably siblings, and one is a child and one is an infant or something like that, because the size of the plots, the size of the rows, infant rows are narrow. And the White Potter's Field has a lot of infant rows in it. If you walk it, probably the first 20 rows are just infants. You know, the headstones are for infants. So this one is one of the few instances where this is one of the February 1923, these two burials, they're husband and wife. And so I do not know what it means to be buried in a potter's field. I had thought it meant that you were indigent, but they got buried next to each other. They didn't die on the same day. Like one died and the other one died the next day. So, oh, the only other thing I want to point out, let me go back here because this is just interesting to me, but I'm going to scroll back here. I meant to point it out earlier. I beg pardon for all these things that we'll scroll through here, but look at this date. I mean, look at this peak here. Here, oops, darn it, I got too excited. Okay, it did that. That wasn't me. So that peak here, if you look down here, see 1918? Look how, so we expect 1917, 1918 to have a lot of flu dead. If you look at the ledger for non-Potter's Field, people are dropping like flies. It is pretty bad, but how bad? So if in a typical year they had 200 burials, then in 1917 and 1918 they had 250 and 300. So it's not heinous, but the Potter's Field is not where people were going when they died of the flu, and at least not on the ledger. You know, not in a way where they would also end up in the ledger. So it's not till later that we start seeing, oh, like 13, the most recorded, you know, the most number of records that were maintained. I don't know that I'll be able to figure out what provoked an entry into the ledger, because I'm assuming people always paid, or it wasn't always based on pay, but we don't have the original books, or if we do, we don't have access to them. There's one other, let's see if I can get it to come up here. We're almost full with this. Yep, we're getting close to 1933. Ah, see, mother and child right here. So it's not an error, it's a mother and child. And there's another mother and child entry. Oh, those are the Suttons, the Sutton family. So this idea of filling in people next to, you know, they died in the same month and they can go in the same row. No, they died in consecutive months. Okay, here's October 1927 next to November 1927. You know, days in between. It wasn't like 30th to November 1st. It was just, okay, we'll put them there. So there's not a like fill up the row attitude towards installing people. And you see down here last, these odd rows, 51, 52, and 53. I call them odd. they are the last burial numbers, I mean, not rows, these last burials to show up and be filled. So certainly by 1933, those are the last entries into the ledger for the White Potter's Field. There aren't any others, at least I went at least to 2002, there aren't any other burials recorded for the White Potter's Field. What I can see, and I don't have a graphic because I didn't want to kill you guys anymore with these lines, is that after 1929, there's a shift in practice in the way individuals are buried. And that shift has to do with sections 1 and 12 that were installed, right? So after 1929, the idea of installing the people in the cemetery turns into seal the row. And I don't know what else caused the shift. Maybe there was a change in public sentiment. In 1910, the newspaper narrative was that the cemetery was full because the plots had been sold. But then they replatted by 1917, but they replatted and put in a lot of single grave burials. So these are, it could be indigent still, but you buy one grave. You don't buy a block or even part of a block or a quarter. You buy one grave and you're put one person in it. But for those kind of burials, they were filling them up. They were putting in people nearly consecutively by day or by week. It's that congested. And just that boom, 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 boom. And I'm like, well, what changed? Well, the sexton, Mr. Phoebe, he's a sexton from 1878 till he disappears in 1929. And by disappear, I mean, he doesn't show up on the city directory in 1930. And he stops making monthly or even annual sexton reports. So he's not around. And after that, this kind of, let's put him here approach to burial, but let's put them here, but stick to like west and north as much as we can until we run out of space. That's gone. It's put everybody in there. And it's not so gone that colored people were occurring outside of section 15 as far as the most extent, but section 14 is pretty full too by then. But I cut that slide because I figured you guys would be done. So other resources. So the ledgers only has so much resource for us, even though it's the only record the city has left of burials in the cemetery. I mean, the city hasn't yet, well, they might have while we've been gone, but they haven't gone and done a headstone survey and then populated it into the ledger. So you can see headstones there. Not Mr. Morgan, Audie Morgan's is in the ledger, but you can walk the Black Potter's Field, see headstones, write down their name, they won't be in the ledger, but you're standing on the headstone, they're there. So that work still has to be done. It needs to be done to intersect with, well, the newspaper accounts. So out of the newspaper, you can find things like sexton reports. This is just a list of the annual ones I've been able to find so far. And this is just, what do people say about the cemetery? So 1907, 1910, 1911. So the sexton would give a report to the city commissioners. The city commissioners met like once or twice a week, depending on the week, often twice a week. And at the beginning of the month, the sexton Phoebe would come and make a report. And sometimes the newspapers would publish that report. So what's the notice? This is how they reported the demographics, adults and children. Okay, so all adults, all children, Black, white, Mexican, and Indian. On this one, this is Tukabachi, because I looked him up, because 1910 is when Tukabachi and this guy, I don't know the context, but this other guy, Tom Coney, they're moved to Oglon. We passed their burials all the time when we would escort the remains to the lab for our analysis. So that's those two Indians for that year, 1910. Native Americans weren't getting buried in this cemetery, generally. There's some ish, but generally not in a recorded way, at least not while I only have access to the newspaper's accounts of the sexton's report, because it's not complete. And I am making inquiries about, does anyone have just all of them? But if it's a city report, the city doesn't have it, or at least the city clerk can't find it, any such document. And I get it, but there's still the county. And so I'm hoping that vital statistics through the county might have something, but these reports weren't delivered to the county, they were delivered to the city when they reported. But you can at very least, there's one other issue to point out. Let's look at 1920. 117 Black people were buried in Oak Lawn Cemetery. The sexton's reporting for Oak Lawn. So he buried 117 Black people. So he buried, oh, and this is the annual report. They don't break down adults versus juveniles in the annuals, just the monthly reports. Where are they? So you go, oh, 117. How many people got buried in section 13 and 14, the colored sections? 2, just 2. And it's 15, no one colored that year. So where are they? Oh, you know where they are. And so, but records, no. So I'm really hoping the only thing being hidden in the Black Potter's Field is the 1921 race massacre. That is my hope, because they threw out all those records. I just hope it's not something, that the solution isn't something obvious, like map the headstones, look for blank areas and dig those up, because we are missing at least 21. If there are more people buried without caskets just piled in there are going to be some, areas without headstones, and we haven't mapped the headstones. I feel like we're avoiding the obvious, but man, at any rate, one other bit of literature, is for, digging through the records, and Clyde Snow mentioned this in his report. He said, we know there's more, there are going to be more burials of some kind. So we need to look at more death certificates because of these numbers, these 18, the number of persons that died after Morris Willows set up the field hospital. There was a field hospital in Booker T. Washington High School, but it had to move by September 1st because school was starting. So Morris Willows was able to get funding, and he had the supplies, and the leaders of Greenwood came together and built the hospital with the lumber and materials that Willows provided. And at first it was called the Morris Willows, Hospital. Well, it was called that for a while because when he handed it over to the Black community, the Greenwood community, it was the Morris Willows Hospital. So I don't know how many years it stayed that name, but 18 people died in the hospital after the riot, before the handoff, before he wrote this report in December 1921. So where are they? Now, they might be found by just looking at every single death certificate between June and December. Not cheap, but doable. So we could find them maybe just on paper, because remember, the city was getting better and better about vital statistics. So there's a good chance. But look at this number. First aid cases during and after riot. This is Black and white individuals, but that's a lot of first aid to only come up with 39 people dead. Now, I don't have an algorithm. I don't know what proportion of dead people you should expect for first aid, a ratio. There may not be a formula, but clearly there was enough chaos that 500 extra people needed to seek first aid, not just the ones that had to go to the hospital, which is, a different number. Number of Negro cases hospitalized since riot. So that's in this report term, 98. So people that were receiving hospital care, so they had to go to the hospital. First aid wasn't cutting it. 233. So while many of them recovered, and I didn't have time to paste it in here, while many of them recovered, if you look in that same report, Morris Willows' report, look further down, he has a list of people who are just homeless, essentially, or permanent hospital cases because of the riot. And one of them is a boy who he has almost got his disease. Okay, I'll get it later. But there's a boy who his mother was killed in the riot. So he's homeless. And I'm like, his mother was killed in the riot? There are no women. There are no dead women. So, okay. So then that's what I've learned in the time since July doing the literature search, the record investigation, like Clyde Snow started with our list of documented dead. And I hope next time, next report, even our report coming out soon, maybe to put a little more information about this is what the literature is telling us about where to go next. Thank you for your patience.
I wish you could hear thunderous applause, which I would be here if you were here in person. I want to remind everyone that they can use the Q&A feature in order to ask questions. I also have a question in the chat. So I'll be fielding questions. I'll start with a pretty straightforward one from Marisa Miller Acosta, who is wanting to know, will the project continue? And what other attempts you will use to discover and identify others from the massacre, because she's interested in being able to volunteer.
Well, to my knowledge, we will continue. Mayor Bynum is still on board. We're a seasonal venture, so I am highly aware that we're dependent, at least I'm very dependent on warm weather for excavation because I get cold. So, and it can't be raining. I didn't include the photo, but the way the site looked after we had a week solid of rain that ended our field season this year. So I have every expectation of returning to excavate the at least the Black Potter's Field. Now that I have a better grasp of just what went on generally, I think we'll go back there just to excavate the 1920s, just the 1920s. We are also right now pursuing the DNA analysis of the adults that we did exhume. And I don't know if that timeline will allow for, the DNA analysis timeline may not be completable in time for us to benefit from its information, but IDs from that might help us with getting a feel for how the cemetery, which zone we should be in the Black Potter's Field for excavation, because death certificates may tell us when those people that we have exhumed were buried. So we have two prongs. So we're still ongoing in the sense of the DNA analysis, and my colleagues and I are producing our written report. I'm doing the skeletal part, tightening that up, and we're going to compile all of it. And I'm hoping it'll be distributable in a broad way, because some of the imagery, well, the skeletal material, we don't share images of that. The excavation process itself and the scope and just the orderliness of that cemetery is very informative. So I'm hoping it'll transfer. As far as volunteering, it'll be another volunteer kind of program. I mean, we discussed having a program for the excavation phase, because we did have volunteers this summer, but it wasn't. We were seeking volunteers from the Public Oversight Committee members, and we just barely, if you squint, had enough. So there may be a different opportunity, another way, another scope for volunteering, but it is a community activity, but I can't tell you yet how to volunteer. Cemetery. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I was reading. Yeah, should I or should I let you moderate, because you're moderator?
I wanted to just draw everyone's attention to the fact that in the chat, there's also the website that you can go to for more information about the Clyde Snow Award, about our call for nominations that is about to come out, and also about ways to donate to the award, just in case people came in late and didn't see that before. There was, would you like to read it, or I can read it, however you prefer?
Oh, yeah, because sometimes it scrolls and gets away from me. I see a question. Which order?
I'll go ahead.
Okay.
So there's a question that says, hello, Dr. Stubblefield. This might be an odd question, but I would appreciate your answer. Personally, as a European anthropology student, I've noticed certain trends among American anthropologists and students of anthropology, which I find odd. Very often people who do not belong in a minority group, while still being professionals, have their opinion seen as less valuable by others because of it. For example, in a conversation about ancestry estimation and race, I've seen people dismiss professors and doctors of anthropology because they were not people of color. Do you share this sentiment? And if so, can you elaborate on why? Thank you very much in advance.
Do I share the sentiment of dismissing others because they're not people of color? No. I don't share. I don't share it. I try hard not to share in practices where there's any kind of contempt or being dismissive of others. That's the first problem. That alone. But the idea of, oh, you can't know anything about race because you're not a person of color, um, you might not be able to know anything about racism in the front of your brain if you are the one being racist, but everyone can be racist. You just have to have your target race. I mean, race, and what is target race? Race is defined the way you define it. You know, that group label is defined the way you populate it. So you can let it be skin color, you can let it be lack of skin color. Uh, I don't cater to the, so what I do is I try not to be a mind reader. So if someone's, unless they start using race labels, I don't see bad behavior as racism. I see it as bad behavior. At least that's what I'm trying to do. But as far as working with colleagues or having attitudes, I mean, yeah, it is a trend of academia or any profession really to want to own your field so much that you exclude other people from it at all costs. But that's not how I operate. So no, I don't share that attitude. I don't find it productive or helpful. It's just like a version of name calling to me.
There's a quick question and then two related questions. The quick question is whether you can say where the Tulsa Cemetery is located.
The Oak Lawn Cemetery is located it's between Peoria and Madison, which doesn't actually run through there. So it's between Peoria and the interstate, and 8th Street and 11th Street. 11th Street is Route 66. So if you're getting your kicks, you'll pass by the cemetery and you should stop. And it's not as park-like as the Memorial Park Cemetery, whatever street that is, Memorial. But it was a good start. Oak Lawn was intended as a park. So and they did a good job. The sexton, at least the original one, he made a good try. Okay, what was the other quick question? I'm sorry.
So there are two, one from Grace Benham, who's a graduating senior in anthropology, and the other from Rilla Askew, who I believe you know. They're both about the reburial. Grace asks, she says, it's my understanding that the city of Tulsa reburied a number of people in July without the consent of the community, whether you can provide information about that. And Rilla Askew says, I'm wondering about the reinterment of those disinterred in June. Some in the Tulsa Greenwood community disagreed with that decision. So they'd like you to comment on that.
It was, I do agree, it was not a mutual decision between community members, and not all community members, because we had members of the Public Oversight Committee present when we had the discussion of to reinter or not to reinter. But I can say that for my focus, I have issues with keeping people who are intentionally buried above ground just for my own interests. And so in light of having the appropriate specimens for DNA analysis, the components of those individuals that might get them ID'd, it was not necessary to keep all of them above ground in order to have those parts, the best parts for DNA analysis. And I appreciate having them reburied because of that. And this is another one of those biases on my part, the history of not forensic anthropology so much, but the history of biological anthropology and the history of anatomy instruction in this country is based on access to Black bodies. And one of my concerns whenever there's a collection of Black people who are skeletonized is that there'll be other people not Black who are looking to use that collection. And if you need an example, be a Black person and do like I did and sell your DNA to 23andMe, and then see how often they contact you about research, because Black people aren't well represented in the genetic samples either. And let alone a skeletal sample. And yes, I have been contacted about using the people we dug up, using them, not identifying them per se, or getting their narrative told just for the purpose of the race massacre, their identity and the analysis that I'm doing now, not for that, but for other purposes, using them. And Black people are used, have been used, probably will be used again. But I like to contribute to that a little bit less. I mean, except for me being used, because that happens, of course. But yeah, that's why I'm in support of that we rebury them. We didn't rebury the DNA samples. So, and that I needed to, that's what I needed, that their DNA samples not be reburied, and they weren't.
Well, we've had some recent examples, including the use of the remains of people who were murdered by the city of Philadelphia, the attack on the Move compound. So this is not old history. In fact, it's quite recent and painful for anthropologists. In case, well, we see if there's any other questions. I did have a question because I know that there's been talk about another possible location where some of these bodies were buried or gotten rid of, which is over by the river. And I see you're obviously you're drawing on these records that are available, however spotty, in Oak Lawn. But have you been looking into or working towards doing excavations over in that area?
We hope to, but that's our big we, So as a physical investigation committee, we have 3 spots of interest. Wait, did I get that count right? It's really 4. So Oak Lawn has 2 spots in it. The Clyde Eddy spot, which is somewhere in the White Potter's Field, but may have been, I went to the White Potter's Field with Mr. Eddy back in the 90s when he was alive, and he pointed broadly. So he might have been referring to an area that was actually in the Black Potter's Field for that he saw staging of multiple bodies for burial on June 2nd. So the Clyde Eddy area, if we could relocate it, it's the second zone in Oak Lawn. But then there's the Canes and New Block Park, and those are by the river. And then there's another area, so I guess that's really 5. It used to be Booker T. Washington Cemetery, now it's Rolling Oak Cemetery. That's a privately owned cemetery, so the probability of doing any excavations there are very low. But the other areas, New Block Park is city owned. It has a narrative of statements by white eyewitnesses handed down of possible mass grave there and or the Canes. The Canes is an area I like because it is located beneath a railroad bridge. So it is a location where in the narrative of rail cars loaded with bodies, someone could lower bodies from the rail line to a pit burial below. And I would like to examine that area more closely. It's problematic because it is a homeless, or traditionally it's a homeless encampment. And when I visited the Canes area, it was a homeless encampment in the sense of I watched a man, woman, stroller, and dog come out of there, and that's pretty lived in. So yeah, I'm not always sure about just disturbing people willy-nilly, but in an organized way, yeah, that's fine. That kind of disturbance is fine. So we don't have a date set for examining the Canes part, and the Canes area isn't all city, so it could be problematic. So yeah, we don't have a date set though for investigating those remaining areas. And certainly Oak Lawn has a lot of my focus because there is enough documentation and enough habit from what I'm seeing in the papers, cultural habit. Where do we bury the dead people? Oh, Oak Lawn. Even the Black dead people? Yeah, Oak Lawn, because the other cemeteries weren't around yet. I mean, Rose Hill, okay, Rose Hill was there. It started in 1916, but it was a privately owned cemetery and it was for white people. Crown Hill didn't exist yet. Its oldest burial is 1925. And Memorial Park, 1927. So yeah, the best, if you didn't get transported, where are you going to bury the Black people if they get into the cemetery? Oak Lawn. But if you have too many, or if you're National Guard and you don't know where to culturally put people, so I like the Canes, but I would love to finish digging in Oak Lawn because I think it will have all of our death certificate people and maybe a few more, because I don't know why they threw the records out.
In addition to several comments in the chat, so congratulating you on a wonderful job. We also have a question from Reem El Zogby, who's one of the members of the Clyde Snow Social Justice Award Committee. And she says, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture and important research. It's truly an honor to hear your insights. You had mentioned that people were often transported back to their towns to be buried. Do you have a sense of how this may have impacted the victims of the massacre? Also, are there other locations or cemeteries that are known outside of Tulsa?
So there weren't any other active cemeteries for like served that Tulsans were, well, because I say that, I mean, there were neighboring towns that like Red Fork Cemetery. People would die in Red Fork, have their death written about in a Tulsa newspaper, but they'd be buried in Red Fork. There was a Catholic cemetery in Tulsa. So I assume if any of the victims were Catholic, they might have been buried there. But oddly enough, we haven't had any records. Maybe I need to ask around now that I think about it. Because Catholic churches tend to be well documented, tend to keep good documentation. I have not contacted the local Catholic church, and they did have their own cemetery. I think I'm missing a cemetery. There were some family-owned cemeteries too, but some of those transitioned out when Oak Lawn opened, and people were like the Perryman Cemetery. Perryman's a powerful, traditionally powerful Native American family in Tulsa, and they had a family cemetery that moved into Oak Lawn burials. But as far as the rate of transport, like many of the white victims or decedents were transported. Three of them, let's see, there were, how many? Okay, there were 18 white ones. I think I'm getting that number wrong, but there were 21 black ones, and it's got to come out to 39. So out of that 18, 3 of them were buried locally in Rose Hill, and the rest transport. So yeah, it was a significant pattern. It's the same pattern in the newspapers though, just because I've got quite an obituary collection for people buried in Tulsa, and a lot of them aren't buried there. They're buried they get transported. Black people too. There was one black newspaper active in Tulsa, the Tulsa Star. It was burned down in the riot, in the race massacre. And they would report deaths. So every now and then Jackson Funeral Home, which was the black funeral home, would report, oh, here are the deaths I have for, like, I don't know, it was that week. Home Funeral Home, their undertaking. They said Jackson Undertaking Company, Home Undertaking Company. Home Undertaking Company became the Tulsa Undertaking Company later. It would also process black people. And then later there was Ragsdale Undertaking Company, and they would take black people as well. But Jackson, which became Jackson Goodwin, was, and later Jack's Memory Chapel, was the black one, and then later Home, and then Ragsdale. So they would publish, here are the death notices. And so I get, oh, okay, finally, record of black people dying. If they're buried in 14 or 13, they'll be in the ledger. Yeah, they're never in the ledger. They're not in it. They're just never there. And I don't know how much of that is, especially when it says buried in this city. These were buried in this city. No, they're not, at least not according to the ledger. But we know the ledger is missing information, right? So the difficulty is, even with newspapers, I mean, the newspaper is your social view into how people were living and dying. But the newspapers, they're written by human beings. The ledgers populated by human beings. So you see errors in the newspaper. You see errors in the ledger. Usually there are errors in spelling, but the date is about the only sure thing, give or take. If you're looking at a weekly versus a daily newspaper, weekly newspapers are unreliable on reporting the date of death. They report the date of burial as the date of death, and you look at the ledger and like, that person was dead by the time. So long story short, I look at the rate of transport as a artifact of the nature of Tulsa as an oil boom town that attracted people in. But before about and it may be that 1929, 1930 window, but think of it in terms of when were people from Tulsa? You know, how long were you living there as a original settler? Because they would give notices of original settlers dying, non-Native American ones, originals. How long did you have to be there before you would die there and be buried there? And it's not right away, but something else happens, and I just haven't figured out what it is, that after 1929 or by 1929, many people start being buried in Oak Lawn in a year until the single burial spaces are full, and I don't know yet what it is. So transporting, I don't know, maybe the cost of transport changed or something, but it's just what, it's what people do. They transport.
I know we're getting late, so I want to give you a couple of last questions. I also want to say, as sad as I am that we weren't able to bring you to give this talk live, we did have nearly 60 people who were following the lecture, including Arian May's osteology class from San Diego. So they've showed up in the chat. David Wheelock asked, he said that there was the official who said he was feeding the grave diggers. Were they working at Oak Lawn or another location?
Yeah, we don't have data. So we only know they were digging graves. That's actually all we actually know, is they were digging graves. Where? Now, I mean, granted, Oak Lawn was a segregated cemetery. Tulsa was a segregated city. I mean, Greenwood was not in Tulsa. So don't think like today. Well, actually, I say don't think like today, but I found out that like I was making inquiries about funeral directors here in Gainesville, and a funeral director said to me, "Oh yeah, that this particular funeral home will bury Black people." And I'm like, "Well, of course they'll bury Black people. Money's green. They'll bury money." But apparently, I'm under a misconception. So at any rate, but think this is 1921. Segregation is in full swing. Jim Crow laws, there's still years of anti-miscegenation laws. So you can't marry a Black person. How on earth are you going to be buried near Black people after a certain year? I mean, because clearly it's a big a focus until really around like 1912 or so in that cemetery, because it's that section 15 is the real buffer zone. And if I have more information about the identities of the people buried there, I might make hypotheses about, maybe some of them were mixed race or immediately mixed, like Black or Creek. There's this one woman, Black and Creek, that she actually gets an obituary, but where is she buried? Can't find her burial. It's that thing again, can't find it. And she's buried there probably because she died in a poorhouse, but find her burial. So, I mean, yeah.
So Jen Dewey also was interested in what you were doing with the gravestones, because of course.
No, we put them back. We had mapped them in before we removed them. So they go right back where but we were, and I haven't discussed this with the city since I've been working on the report, but we had plans to buy markers for our 19 individuals. And if we get IDs, get their names above ground. And that's really important to me. It may turn into another project later, because the Tulsa Race Massacre is its own project, its own pursuit. Find our heroes that were thrown out. Some of the World War I veterans, they just threw and called them insurrectionists in the newspaper, which annoys me to this day, despite it is 100 years later and I wasn't even alive then. But a lot of Black cemeteries, as you probably know, in the news, it was just habit they get erased. And I try to be a little bit neutral because I recognize that, like, take my parents, they grew up in Tulsa and then they moved to California. But on the other hand, where do they want to be buried? My parents have passed. Where do they ask to be buried? They asked to be buried back in the cemetery where I think it's my father's relatives had moved to in that first round of post-Reconstruction migration, the first round. So, my father's grandmother moved to Oklahoma as her place of freedom, of property ownership, land ownership. the Great Migration. So my parents say, hey, bury us back there. Don't bury us in California. Well, they didn't say don't, they just said bury us back there. So I'm like, oh, okay, it's that cemetery where they want to be buried in is maintained still. It's still there, and it has headstones, and it's maintained. It's mown. The headstones are upright. But if you migrate, if everyone left, or too many of everyone left, and your cemetery is not maintained, they get erased. Someone has to stand up for that cemetery to keep it, to keep the park-like model, or just the family history model, especially if your cemetery was on land you didn't own, like in the early, like if you were property and then you left your loved ones buried there, and then the landowner is like, well, I didn't care about those people anyway, and they mess up your cemetery. Yeah, that's the circumstance we're in now. And public cemeteries that have been built over and erased. So the Oak Lawn Cemetery is not in danger of being built over, I don't think. I mean, it is a park-like cemetery, but it's downtown in its original location. And it has erased individuals in it now because of some action in the 1930s to discard their records, just their records. So I hope we'll correct that. But we're definitely planning on correcting it for the 19 we've dug up so far.
You remind me actually of the work that was done to recover the names of the victims of the plane crash over Los Gatos Canyon that was made famous through Woody Guthrie's song, often known as Deportee, where the refrain is all they were called was deportees. And there was a big project where people went and found the names, and then they very recently, 100 years later, erected a memorial marker with the names of these people. I can show you some links about this because it's a beautiful project just in and of itself to memorialize those people and to address the erasure.
Yes.
So towards not erasing, we have a question about whether the project, the investigative project, has a website where you're giving people updates that they can follow.
The City of Tulsa, the 1921 Graves City of Tulsa website is our official website. It's where new press releases and all of our reports are published. So, and images from the field, the ones that are releasable, they're there and available to the public. So please follow that website. I imagine that once the city figures out which death images are shareable or not, because I don't know. Once they figure that out, they'll be available through there as well, if that's a thing. I don't know that that's a thing. So, but certainly our written reports will be published there.
And the final comment then is from Deborah Green, who says, Dr. Phoebe, I agree with you about the canes. I'm ready to continue our soil coring. Nice presentation.
Thanks, Deb. Deb is great. She's the best. She causes me geologist envy because I'm like, why don't I have a Deb? But yeah, there are two, especially when you're a forensic anthropologist, there are two other specialists you should have by you: a chemist, if you can all get your own chemist, get one, and a geologist for when you have to go out to the field, unless you're in a place that doesn't do burials, doesn't have a lot of burials, because forensic, burying people is hard work. And so often they don't get buried very well, but Deb is great.
So I can't thank you enough. There are many thank yous in the chat, but this has really been such a powerful discussion of the kind of ongoing work that is happening and why it's important that it happen. I'm sure that there are people who've been listening who are very familiar with the story, and others who are very new to it. And hopefully they'll go to the website and find out more about what you're doing and find ways to support your efforts.
Well, I do have one thing I'd like to ask those of you who remain. If you have any interest in supporting the project, please show Mayor Bynum some support, because he's caught in both directions with having started an investigation in an area that's important to Black Tulsans, but at the same time exposing the other issues involved in this investigation with the questions of reparations and how to repair the harm of 100 years. And this investigation has distinct elements of, if you're a Christian, you might say, oh yeah, the sins of the fathers being punished, the children being punished for the sins of the fathers for 2 or 3 generations, because this has generational scope in the level of harm. But this is a scab that needs to be peeled off and not half peeled. And for someone like Mayor Bynum, he's caught in that half peel state. If you give him words of encouragement, he may be able to finish. I mean, I'm not saying that he's not able, but I put myself in his position, only, politics too, and knowing that there are going to be Black Tulsans that say, I've seen the Black Tulsans say, you're not doing enough. But I was here 20 years ago and we went away. The commission closed itself. So I know that can happen again, but we broke ground. And I saw the remains of an individual, a Black male in a plain casket with gunshot wounds. I'm thinking there's 20 more. And he was buried next to an infant. That might have been the one infant, because they were kind of strange. But I'll let my archaeological colleague express that. But I saw that 20 years ago, we went poof. This time we broke ground. But to find them, to find the rest, we really need to support all of the players. And if that means also, telling your community members, telling the public oversight committee members that, I hear what you're saying, tell them I hear what you're saying. If it means telling Mayor Bynum, you're doing a good job, and not just for this, but in other areas too, tell him he's doing a good job. Because, I don't live in Tulsa, but he's done a good job. So thanks. If you have that capacity, please tell him something encouraging.
And please do visit the Clyde Snow Social Justice Award website for more information and support our efforts globally for people who are doing this kind of work. So with that, I want to thank you once again for a fascinating lecture and for helping us remember Dr. Snow's work. And we hope we will see you again sometime, hopefully in person.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us. Good evening.
Have a good evening.